Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, Ukraine War Frontline update for the 8th of November 2023. Before we go to the front line to look at the axes up and down Ukraine, it's worth noting that there are claims that Russian freedom fighters are active near Kursk. So Kursk is a Russian oblast to the north of Ukraine. We go to my map here. Thank you to JR who has done mapping. Here is Kursk along the border to Ukraine near to Sumy. Somewhere along there, Ukrainian or pro-Ukrainian Russian forces are active. I was just reading that there's a unit 70 strong of Ukrainian POWs in Russia that are going to be sent to the front line to fight for the Russians. Interesting. I'll have a look into that report on that tomorrow. Anyway, if you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please pause the video and check out the key. Let's move on to, actually we're going to go to, as you can see the map there, we're going to go to the northeast to Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna front line. The axis there is somewhat quiet in terms of territory exchanges. There are no changes to the map as I use, but there are claims that the Ukrainians need to watch out for the Russians perhaps renewing attacks from Travnevi all the way down to towards Petropavlivka, which is over here. So there could be some attacks down there to try and interdict the ground line of communication, the road here that goes from east-west past Petropavlivka here. So it claims that the Russians could be renewing attacks there. They have been attacking Yahidny and Ivanivka previously, and indeed from Travnevi as well. Anyway, repelled attacks up and down this front line, but nothing more to discuss with regards to changes in territory, and the same can be said about Bakhmut. There's a little more to be said there, though. The ISW reports that the Russians are counterattacking in a number of places along that sector. Another Russian mill blogger claimed on November the 6th and 7th that Russian forces regained lost positions in the direction of Zelenopolia and advanced to Vasyukivka and Saku Vanseti. But ISW's not seen this, not seen evidence of this. So just to let you know where those places are. So Kurdy and Mivka to the south, as a small area, small settlement called Zelenopolia just to the north of it. The Russians are pushing back there, as according to Russian sources, and also advancing in the Vasyukivka and Saku Vanseti areas around here. That is advancing to Vasyukivka and taking back lost ground in Saku Vanseti, where they were pushed back. Oh, goodness me, I don't know, 6 weeks ago, maybe, I don't know, a month ago, something like that. But I think whether this is true or not, it seems to me that the Ukrainians have stopped making those consistent gains, and the Russians are pushing back as much as they can do in the Bakhmut area. I think that much appears to be the case. A Russian mill blogger claimed on the 6th that Russian forces counterattacked north of Klishchiivka and south of Andriivka, and a Russian news aggregator claimed that Russian forces pushed Ukrainian troops back from a section of the railway line between Klishchiivka and Andriivka. So again, talking to this idea that the Russians are pushing back in areas where the Ukrainians have previously been advancing towards the Russians. So that is Bakhmut for you. We're now going to come down to Avdiivka, to the south of Bakhmut. You can see there are quite a few pins in this area from different mappers. So this, thanks JR again to this, there are some increased, there's evidence of increased Russian control of these tree lines to the east of Stepova and to the west of Krasnohorivka. Now, we've already had Suryat Maps, a pro-Russian mapper, claiming that the Russians had control over the tree line and several days in a row have increased that control. Well, now Andrew Perpetua is catching up with what Suryat Maps has claimed, at least in part. There's some evidence to suggest that that northerly section of the railway line and the tree lines is under control of the Russians. This is a real challenge for the Ukrainians because it's next step over, and that would increase their chances of operationally encircling Avdiivka and the G-Lock coming in to the west of Avdiivka there, just by Lastochkirna. So yeah, they don't want this to improve for the Russians anymore. The Ukrainians, it's challenging, and then of course there is the threat of moving into the coke plant to the northwest of Avdiivka as well, across that railway line. So that is certainly a worry for the Ukrainians. Then as we come to the south, Deep State map, the pro-Ukrainian mapper, has Russians either rejigging or clarifying positions, Russians moving forward, but actually Suryat map has some Russian gains to the north of the sand quarry that they had previously taken control of. Suryat maps here says that in during the last hours, they said last night, the Ukrainian army managed to reach again the first main defense line, and troops are trying to maintain the ground under heavy artillery. Sorry, that's not what I'm talking about. That's actually what we're going to come to later. I was reading that thinking, my goodness, that is not. I should be reading about Russians gaining. So the reality is, as a result of positional battles, Russian army made new advances north of the quarry, trying to capture Ukrainian trench systems northwest of Opitny. So that is good news for the Russians in this area as they're creeping forward, and we'll learn about this or hear about this kind of creeping advances. However, slightly further to the west, to the north of Vodyanya here, Deep State map has Ukrainian gains, although I think it's probably clarification as opposed to gains, and that could be the case for much of the movement there for Deep State along those lines. It's hard to tell. If we go to the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank again, claims about Avdiivka are Russian mill bloggers claiming yesterday that Russian forces advanced near Severny but did not enter the settlement. That would be a challenge because Severny there is holding out and stopping the Russian encirclement of Avdiivka. It's a really important settlement, a bit like Stepova is to the north. Stepova and Berdichi there are stopping the Russians advancing and encircling to the north, while Severny does that to the south. It's a slight worry if the Russians really are advancing. We've seen Suryat maps claim that there have been some advances, marginal advances over the last week or so. ISW could be referring back to that. Mill bloggers also claim that Russian forces advance along the river from Vodyany in the direction of Pervomaisky, and that Russian forces control the waste heap north of Avdiivka, but that Ukrainian artillery is preventing Russian forces from consolidating positions there. Okay, so the idea that the Russians are advancing along the river, along this waterway, going towards the west from Vodyany, towards or north of Pervomaisky, really, but also that the waste heap here, the Terracon, is under control of the Russians, but they can't really do anything with it because they're hemmed in by Ukrainian artillery, which is active in the area. Furthermore, Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces have switched to a creeping offensive in the Avdiivka direction after Russian forces conducted a heavy onslaught in the first days of the attack. So that heavy onslaught did gain them some territory, and now they're looking to marginally creep forward using infantry as opposed to huge amounts of mechanized equipment. They've lost so much, I doubt whether they could use too much more equipment in the area. Suggesting that the pace of Russian offensive operations in this area has slowed. However, you can argue slowly wins a race. It doesn't really matter on the speed as long as they are taking back that territory. And in this case, you don't need a lot. As I've said a number of times, you don't need a lot of territory in order to cut this grand line of communication and really functionally encircle Avdiivka. As the ISW continues, another Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces are suffering from a shortage of electronic warfare. So that's significant complexes in the Avdiivka direction, which is allowing Ukrainian forces to establish control in the air in the area. It's about eking out whatever advantage you can. And if the Ukrainians can get an aerial advantage in terms of what drones can do, and given how prevalent and important drones are in this conflict, then that's a really significant competitive advantage over the Russians. The Russians have the ability to use their fixed-wing aircraft to drop aerial bombs in a way that the Ukrainians just simply cannot. I don't know whether it's still issues with JDAM, either in terms of whether JDAMs, these joint direct attack munitions that are the US version of the FAB 500, the guided glide bombs. Ukrainians, is it an issue that they don't have many of these? Is it an issue that they don't have, or that these are more easily jammed by Russian electronic warfare, which has been a claim that's that's been thrown around previously, or it could just be, and this is more probably the case, that the Ukrainian fixed-wing aircraft can't get close enough to release these. So the Russians appear to have an air advantage where they've got air-to-air missiles that are longer range than the Ukrainian air-to-air missiles that they can carry on airplanes. And so when it comes to sorties to drop these bombs, the Russians can do so pretty much with impunity. They can get to 70 kilometers from the front line and drop these bombs. The Ukrainians struggle to do that given the presence of Russian air defense systems, and it's why and Russian aircraft that can shoot down those Ukrainian aircraft, and it's why it's so important that the Ukrainians continue to hammer Russian air bases with ATACMS and other missiles, whilst also taking out air defense systems as much as they possibly can. Right, now we're going to move down to the southern front line past Mariinka and Novomykhailivka, which are, as you can imagine, still pretty active. Paragraphs on this here. Positional battles around Mariinka, but also quite active around Novomykhailivka and then going down to Vuhledar. But as we come down to the Velika Novosilka salient, no confirmation of any gains. A few claims here and there about what is going on in Velika Novosilka, but generally quietened down a lot compared to what it was months ago. And then we're going to move now to Robotyne, where interestingly there are a couple of claims to gains in the Robotyne area. And I think just like the Russians up in the Avdiivka area are talking about a creeping offensive, I think you could apply that to the Ukrainians here. And creeping offensives are still taking ground. They are still achieving those goals, still keeping the defensive forces on their toes. The question is whether it is too attritional for the attacking forces to continue doing this in both cases, the Russian and the Ukrainian case. But here, at any rate, they are doing so. And we've talked about previously about how during this winter period, autumn-winter period, the Ukrainians do need to keep putting the pressure on the Russians to fix their troops in place so that they can't consolidate even more than they already have. And that appears to be what is happening. Here we have some claims from the ISW. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces are entrenched in unspecified forest areas near Verbove, and that a lack of Russian control of the air in the area is complicating Russian artillery fire. So this could well be with reference to drones spotting for artillery as opposed to actual the Russian Air Force. I think it's more likely the same issue that they're having up in Avdiivka with regard to electronic warfare asymmetry there. So the Russian artillery is struggling to fire on positions. I would say also that they've probably had good degradation of the Russian artillery in that area as well. The mill blogger claimed that a Ukrainian reconnaissance group approached western Verbove and that a small arms engagement is ongoing in the area. So there is activity to the west of Verbove. We can also see, according to deep state maps, that the Ukrainians have made gains to the north of Verbove, really northwest. But actually, to be fair, the deep state map is behind the other maps in where they think the Russian defensive line is. So even Surat Maps has them further back, and Andrew Perpetua even further back just to the north of Verbove itself. So that might not be gains from yesterday, but more sort of catching up with what other mappers are saying. However, something that I think is significant, especially since there is evidence that these tree lines to the east of Novoprokopivka in this southern part of the Robotyne sector, this was taken by some pretty competent Russian forces active in the area. Well, if Surat Maps has Ukrainian gains directly there and a little bit between there and Novoprokopivka, then that I think is really significant. It'd be interesting to see if Andrew Perpetua catches up with this or disagrees with it, more formally, what the situation here is. Because if the Ukrainians have taken that area back, then I think that is good news for the Ukrainians. And they can carry on trying to push across both the tank ditches here and then the manned trench lines to fully take control over this sector of the Russian first line of defense. That will be really important. It's taken a long time though, and is heavy going for the Ukrainians there. But yeah, that's all that can be said. Really needs to be said about that area. There is activity still going on in the Piatiketki area to the west, towards Kamyanska and the Vasyakivka sector here. So Pyatiketki is a small village there. Activity still around there. And then we're going to come to the Kherson Oblast to Dnipro River. No changes to the mapping, but a lot are to be said. Actually, I didn't. This is the Surat maps. I accidentally read you earlier that the Ukrainian army managed to reach the first main defense line, and troops are trying to maintain the ground under heavy Russian artillery. So that's exactly what I was just saying before. Anyway, sorry, I meant to share that with you. Right, we're going to go to talk about mainly the Krinky area, but this Dnipro River section of the front line where it is incredibly active, and there are lots of sources reporting on this, more than pretty much anywhere else at the moment. If we go to the ISW first, because they've got quite a large section on this area, and then pop into some of the other sources that are slightly more recent. This would have been compiled last night. Russian sources claim that Ukrainian forces transferred a limited number of armoured vehicles to the east bank of the Kherson Oblast. So that's something that I reported in that breaking news piece previously, and are continuing larger than usual ground operations on the east bank with the light infantry grouping of roughly battalion size. There's a fairly sizable number of troops over there. Russian mill bloggers amplified a picture on November the 6th purporting to show a Ukrainian tracked amphibious transport PTS vehicle carrying an infantry fighting vehicle onto the bank near Krinky, which again I reported. Other mill bloggers claimed yesterday that a Ukrainian amphibious infantry fighting vehicle crossed the Dnipro on its own near Krinky. So that's an amphibious vehicle just crossing the river there, and amplified separate footage yesterday purporting to show destroyed Western amphibious armoured personnel carrier in an unspecified location on the east bank. I hadn't seen that, but interesting, wouldn't surprise me. I'd say, sadly for the Ukrainians, their vehicles will be fairly easy pickings, even though the Russians are struggling with electronic warfare and therefore struggling with their own drone usage in the area. Select Russian mill bloggers claim that either one or two Ukrainian PTS vehicles crossed the Dnipro near Krinky, while other mill bloggers claim that Ukrainian forces transferred several unspecified armoured vehicles to the area. Russian mill bloggers claim that more than 300 Ukrainian personnel, about a battalion's worth, are operating on the east bank of the near Krinky, and continue to claim that Ukrainian forces maintain positions in central Krinky and nearby areas. One mill blogger claimed that several hundred Ukrainian personnel are operating throughout the East Bank area, and claim that combat engagements continue near Krinky as well as Poima, Pishchanivka and Pidstepny, but did not claim that Ukrainian attempts to advance on the 6th or 7th were particularly larger than in previous days. Ukrainian forces likely conducted initial company-sized assaults across the Dnipro River onto the East Bank on the October the 17th and 18th. The reported battalion-sized Ukrainian force grouping on the East Bank suggests that heavy Russian interdiction efforts along the Dnipro have not prevented Ukrainian forces from transferring additional personnel and materiel to the East Bank. So this started small and is expanding, and the hope for the Ukrainians would be it gets to some kind of tipping point where they can take meaningful amounts of land and interdict things like this highway that runs fairly parallel to the Dnipro, and that will have an effect on Russian logistics. Now, going to Russian sources, Rebar says the situation on the left bank, this is yesterday, of the Dnipro River in Kherson region remains tense. It's not yet been possible to dislodge the enemy from the bridgehead in several areas. In Krinky, the Ukrainian marine units are holding the central part of the village. Last night, after rotation, the assault groups were preparing for an attack to expand the bridgehead, but Russian troops struck the area of concentration with Grad multiple launch rocket systems, forcing the Ukrainians to retreat, so they claim. Here we have a Defense Express director Serhiy Zugrat saying that, quote, "We are talking about at least 3 sections. So there are more areas on the left bank where Ukrainian military can operate." Don't know whether it means they are operating, they can operate. We are talking about at least 3 sections, in particular from 2 bridges, a railway and a road bridge near Antonivsky. And another foothold is being expanded near Krinky, where the enemy unsuccessfully tried to recapture the settlement, but I don't want to fall into excessive expectations again. And obviously there's another place he's talking about, unless he's just meaning the 2 bridges, because they are slightly further apart. They're not right next to each other. You've got the Antonivsky road bridge, the railway bridge, and then you've got Krinky, but we know that they're active in Pidstepny as well and trying to expand their area of control there, whilst also Korsunka is somewhere that has been mentioned, and obviously Kazachi Lahiri between Pidstepny and Krinky. So really fairly active all along there. P-Star 11, I reported this in my news piece this morning, reports on how Russian sources are complaining that their own troops, their own artillery forces, are using Ukrainian-sourced maps from, say, Poulet Volant, who himself relies on Andrew Perpetua, which is these blue lines here, to do their artillery, and they've ended up bombing their own, shelling their own troops and complaining about it, which one talks about how they have a lack of communication and a lack of intelligence in the area, and well, that's pretty much what it says. But two, of course, that they are degrading their own forces, which is never a good thing if you are in a position of desperate defense. And indeed, not the best mood among the occupiers near the Dnipro. This is Dmitry from War Translated reporting. Russian source saying Kherson direction is boiling over. For a year and a half, we, the paratroopers, stood in the Kherson direction where we went forward, destroying the Ukrainian fascists from historically Russian soil at the cost of the lives of our brothers, children, husbands, fathers, and sons. I mean, wonderful propaganda aside, we are not only offended, we are bitter about what is happening now in this direction. The enemy not only managed to move to the left bank, but also took up positions along the bank and occupied parts of the villages. He holds positions and also transports armoured vehicles across the Dnipro, which has islands. We were there and we know that it is possible to hold all this and not let the enemy in. We have a lot of trained full-time military personnel in the rear, a lot of equipment, but there is a shortage on the front line. Interesting that they're claiming that they do have a lot of equipment, just not in the right places or not on the front line. The personnel changes that took place in the Kherson direction were clearly not to the taste of some. Someone leaked not only the location of the newly appointed effective General Teplinsky, but also dealt a strike at him. Thank God, Dad is alive and well. This goes back to what I was talking about this morning. So Teplinsky took over from Makarevich in commanding the forces in this area, and somewhere, I don't really know where, it could be anywhere around there, Teplinsky, he was having a meeting and that was leaked and it was targeted. Teplinsky was not hit, or he certainly wasn't killed, but there were other senior officers that were taken out, as I reported this morning, and that is what this guy is complaining about here. We believe that the airborne forces will again change the situation in this direction and will not allow internal and external enemies to lose the battle and the war. So claiming that there are people giving stuff away internally, but also just issues internally in general. We believe in the victory of the Russian people over the fascists of the Ukrainian Wehrmacht and its Western masters. I mean, completely ridiculous. In the main those kind of sentiments. Russian VDV-related channel on the situation as of this morning in the Kherson region. So another source saying the Ukrainians managed to gain a foothold on the islands near Poima, Pishchenivka, and Pidstepny. The enemy has good fire support from the right bank, with the help of which he conducts attacks in the direction of the above-mentioned villages. There are also battles for Krinky. The enemy managed to advance a little in the direction of the forest. The combat zone is still only expanding. In other words, going back to the area, the Ukrainians are pushing in Pishchenivka, Pidstepny, and Poima. All of these areas, Ukrainians have footholds and are trying to expand, and that they are successfully moving into the forest area effectively to the south of Krinky there. So that's another Russian source. Then we have no reports saying when pro-Russian channel Romanov starts doom posting, which he did previously about hitting their own forces, that there's usually something going on. Sorry, I had to take a phone call. Anyway, what does Romanov, the ultra-nationalist mill blogger, say here, who is, I believe, geographically himself in that area? On the right bank of the Dnipro, he says, everything east of the Antonivsky Bridge, there is a very dense concentration of enemy air defense forces and means. Some of the enemy's air defense means, according to the soldiers, are put 2 to 3 kilometers from the shoreline, and no one works on them, but everyone demands that we fly there. I think what that means is that no one is working in degrading these enemy, which is Ukrainian, air defense systems, and we are still expected to fly in the area. That would be, I assume, using drones as opposed to flying their aircraft, which will be 70 kilometers back from there. So I don't think that the air defense systems put in place 2 to 3 kilometers behind the Dnipro River are going to be affecting the fixed-wing aircraft dropping the bombs, and not least because last night there were supposedly 80 airstrikes along here and 12 airstrikes on Krinky. And I think that is a massive challenge for the Ukrainians, is what do they do about those airstrikes? They are big bombs getting dropped consistently and being able to hit targets on both banks of the river, that are, yeah, it's just a real thorn in Ukraine's side there. Anyway, there are challenges for the Russians, as they themselves are admitting. And then finally here, just a bit of, just to say that there is some footage coming out. The Ukrainian 35th Naval Infantry Brigade Marines are seen moving along the outskirts of Krinky on the left bank of occupied Kherson. Russian sources report that the Ukrainians continue to expand their bridgehead there, and the situation is complex. The old yeah, it's complicated claim. Relationship status, it's complicated. So that there is Ukrainian activity. They are around Krinky. As you can see from that picture, Krinky is starting to look a little bit like Klishchivka, Mariinka, and every other place that that warfare touches. Anyway, that's broadly what all the sources are saying about the area. Again, it's going to be a case of how much equipment can the Ukrainians get across, and to get more equipment across safely, and hoping that it doesn't get hammered by the Russians as it gets across there, you need a longer zone of control. So this whole area from the Antonivsky Road Bridge all the way up to pretty much Korsunka and beyond Dnipropetrovsk would be useful if the Ukrainians can get some control on the east bank there, the left bank, and so therefore be able to get their vehicles across much more safely than I imagine they already can. Because if you're thinking, well, they can only get across at Krinky, maybe a couple of places near Pidstepny, and the bridge, then we know where they're going to be getting their stuff across. We can target that with drones and artillery. And again, this goes back to the conversation about electronic warfare, which is why it's so important for the Ukrainians to take out the Russian ability to use drones all along here, and then they can't spot for artillery, and then you can get your equipment across much more freely, and your troops as well. So this is where it's all happening for the Ukrainians. Interesting, there's a little bit of movement for the Ukrainians around Robotyne, whereas it stopped in Bakhmut, and that had been an area where they had been successful previously. Avdiivka is very dynamic, but certainly one to watch. There's some really interesting areas on the front line to watch here for both sides, and I think the next week will be quite revealing in terms of where winter is going to go. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. I'm going to get back to looking into the fallout of the elections last night in the US, where you would expect coming towards the end of the first term, there'll be a reaction against Biden, but there's been some localized votings, and the Democrats have come out, all things considered, really, really well. It's been fascinating to look at the cultural shift in terms of all sorts of political ideas in places like Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania as well, Mississippi. Going to look out for those results. Anyway, that's not of interest to most of you, but that's what I'm going to be doing with the rest of the afternoon. Take care and speak soon. Toodle pips.